19th century and beginning of the 20th century in Paris. And the art at that time was, of course, astounding and amazing, and it started the path towards all kinds of things that have happened since then and on into the future. The term Impressionism really comes from a specific painting, actually, that was done by Monet, which is this one. It's called the Impression Soleil Levant, in other words, the impression of the sun rising. And the Impressionist painters really were reacting against the current style of painting, which was realistic and often very historic, sometimes with a very distinct subject matter. And the reaction here was that now it becomes really the purpose of the painting becomes to record or to give the impression of something actually often very much from regular life, not a historical event or whatever, but at a particular moment. So with special attention really to the effect of light and how the light will, changing light will change everything. You'll often notice in the Impressionist paintings the water, for example. I mean, this is not exactly color correct, but still, it gives you the idea and it will remind you. But the water and the sky and everything are very strange colors, you know, orange and purple and pink and so on. And part of that is to kind of create an effect, to try to create an impression in us. And another part of it is, it's actually not always that far-fetched. I mean, I'm sure you've all been out at the beach sometime and you see the sun coming down across the water. And maybe for a moment, maybe for 2 minutes, the water isn't blue, it's purple and yellow and pink and all kinds of things, right? And then the next minute it's gone. Now it's back to blue or something like that. So that was kind of their focus. They were finding this moment of the impression of the moment, you could say. The name Impressionism for the style of painting and so on actually came from a critic who saw this painting and wrote a very bad review about it. In other words, he said, it was very sarcastic, and he said things like, oh yes, the impression that this makes is of something completely unfinished. In fact, your average wallpaper is more well-finished than this painting. So he tried to be kind of sarcastic and all that, but that also somehow brought this idea of Impressionism as a title to the forefront, and so it was. The idea of Impressionism, and as it's related to Debussy, it's a little bit problematic and it's a little more interesting than it seems. We usually say, oh yeah, Impressionistic painting, great, it's all that kind of, you know, foggy, fluffy stuff. Impressionistic music, oh yeah, great, it's that kind of foggy, fluffy stuff and so on. It's actually much more interesting than that, and it's much more precise and much more complicated. But the reason for this painting, this is by Cézanne, of course my personal favorite, and obviously it's buildings, right? I mean, it's just houses and so on. The point of it, of course, is that this is the impression of the moment and so on. But I think it's really interesting and really important that what's actually happening is he's starting the thread forward of actual abstract art. Because at this point, I mean, we do recognize that they're buildings, but would we say, ah, yeah, those are beautifully painted and beautifully constructed buildings? I don't know, not really. But what becomes interesting is the geometric shapes, the interaction of positions, the interaction of colors and so on. So the bottom line is, or the basic idea, is that the expression or the feeling or the artistic communication that we're getting from this painting is now separated from the real world. In other words, we're not affected by it because, oh, that's a really beautiful house, or, oh, I wish I lived in that house, or anything like that. We're affected by how the colors and how the shapes and things relate to each other. So this is actually more symbolist style of artistic writing, or sometimes in painting they call it post-impressionism. But this is important because this is really what Debussy, what he identified with. You've probably read or heard that Debussy did not like to be called impressionist. He didn't like it. I think the reason is the earliest impressionist paintings and the expression was maybe a little frivolous from his point of view. But once it goes a little bit beyond that, and we're starting to have abstract meaning in the actual combinations of colors and shapes and so on. This is really Debussy's world that he lives in, and we'll see that a lot in the music as we go. The reason for this is much later, Paul Klee, but I just wanted to make the point about how important Cézanne was, and the artists of his time, for the direction of abstract art. So if we saw, let's say, an older romantic period painting of houses, they'd be very beautiful and elegant and, accurate, right? Cézanne's version, well, we start to lose the detail of the house, and we become more and more interested in the abstract communication of colors and shapes and so on. By the time we get to Paul Klee, this is also architecture. I mean, those are supposed to be houses as well. If you didn't have the title, if I didn't have the title of it, I don't know if would we even guess it was houses? It's just, it becomes shapes and colors and things. And so now the artistic expression is completely removed from the real world. And very similar things are going to happen in Debussy, which I hope to get to in just a minute. So I'm going to switch now from art to music, and I want to say a few things about Debussy's way of composing, okay? The first, maybe the most important thing, is the idea of non-functional harmony. Harmony, of course, means chords, right? Or singing together in harmony, but it means the combination, I hope I don't get in the way, combination of notes to create chords. So if I play, let's say, a C chord, it sounds great, sounds very normal, and it's part of our everyday life and so on. But in the traditional, let's say, Western music from the time of Bach until, until even Beethoven and later until probably 1900 or so, the chords not only could be derived from the scale, but they all have a job, they all have a function. In other words, if I play a scale, completely familiar, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. But what makes the scale so important in Western music and so unique is that it's asymmetrical, which means it's directional. And I'll show you. If I start the scale, can I stop there? No. Oh, thank you, right? We've become trained to understand that the scale has a destination. That's part of the basis of our sort of traditional functional music. So just as that happens within a scale, the same thing happens in chords that are built from the scale. So if I play an easy chord progression, can I stop there? Not really, because we expect, thank you, right? So that's the nature, of course, it's very simplified, of course, but that's the nature of functional harmony. In other words, all these chords have a specific job. They do something in the discourse of the music. So Debussy's number one, I would say, contribution to shifting from traditional to modern usage is he abandons that. In other words, if he has a certain chord, he will use it completely separated from any of its previous function. He will use it because he likes the way it sounds. Okay. So let's say, for example, here's from a piece I'm about to play. Here is a moment. So this chord that he arrives at, this is really, for anyone who knows music, it's just a D flat 7. And a D flat 7 should do this. And then it has function, right? If I play this in that context, you can feel that it's leading somewhere, and where it's leading is, thank you, right? It feels like a nice knit, tightly knit, logical, functional relationship. Okay, but in Debussy's case, he just likes the way it sounds. He likes the color, he likes the combination of notes, and not only that, he likes the combination in comparison with, or in juxtaposition with, what happened before and what's going to happen later. So much like the painters, or think of the Clay or the Cézanne, so much like how they liked the relationship of colors and shapes. Not necessarily because it has a function. In other words, the houses in the Cézanne, it's not even really that important that they're real houses, so the expression is removed from the reality. And in this dominant seventh chord, the expression is removed from its function. I see a really interesting parallel there of abstractness in the way, such that the communication or what he's talking about or what the artist is trying to convey to us is removed from the actual real world. One of the sort of descriptions or comments or whatever about the symbolist or the post-impressionist writers and painters or whatever was that their goal was to find truths and to find understanding and reality and so on in the effect something creates, not in the description of the object. So in other words, if you paint a picture of houses, you're not trying to express any emotion or feeling from the houses themselves, but it's from the effect that this creates upon us. So this is totally right up Debussy's alley, and we'll see it more as we go. But that's very much a common thread. Another example, in this same piece, there'll be a sequence like this. So he arrives at this chord, okay? It sounds kind of dissonant or whatever. But if it were, let's say, Chopin, and he arrived at this chord, he might do. Oh, sorry. Right, it leads very nicely. So this chord is entirely functional. In other words, it has a job, which is to lead us to the resolution. In Debussy, he just likes the way it sounds, and he uses it almost as if he's painting. The first piece that I would like to play is called Reflet dans l'eau, which is Reflection on the Water. It's from 1905, and it's the first of a series of pieces he wrote called Image. Image meaning painting or image or illustration, etc. It's the first one. There are two books, book one and book two. This is number one from book one. And there is no official, I put out this painting, but this of course is Monet Water Lilies. Everyone knows this, or should know it. There's no official connection between those paintings, but it's impossible for me to not make the parallels and relationships. One of the most important, interesting relationships is the idea of motive and texture. So in Debussy's music, actually I stopped what I was saying, but the next thing after functional harmony is the idea of texture. So texture in music means what's happening. Is it a big wide, high notes and low notes and middle notes and so on? Is it just a single note in the middle? That's what we call texture in music. And in Debussy, in this first piece I'm going to play, Reflections on the Water, Reflet dans l'eau, the texture plays a really important role in not only just the sort of general character of the music, but actually in the structure and in the motivic development. So motivic development really means to take a melody and mess around with it. So, for example, the classic idea of motivic development is, everybody knows that motive, right? It's just 4 notes. But the entire symphony is derived from those 4 notes. He combines them, he changes them, he transfigures it to create the second movement, and he transfigures it again to create the third movement. So the idea of motivic development is really that the actual melodic line is changed in various ways. But in Debussy, it's not very often. Oops, I'll go one more. This is some of the music from the Reflection. Some of us, are musicians, they'll read it, some not. But you notice in the little red square, there are 3 notes. So that's a little melody that happens. And then it happens throughout the piece. Here's another place where it happens. But all the surrounding music changes. So the melody itself never changes. It's just the same little tiny musical fragment. But all the texture, everything around it changes. And so that becomes kind of the way of developing, or the way of musical development. There's one more example at the very end. All of these little squares, it's showing that same little 3-note melody, and it's always exactly the same. It just sounds different, and it has different structural importance because of the texture that it's in. So how does that connect to the water lilies? So I see that 3 little notes motive, which stays always the same, but changes because of the texture. I see that very much as the water lilies themselves, right? If you see the the ones that are close to us are kind of round looking, right? So that's showing that we're looking down. The ones that are far, far away are very flat, which means we're looking at them from an angle. So actually the water lilies never change. I mean, a water lily is a water lily, whatever, big deal. But it changes because of its position and its relationship to the rest of the painting. It defines, if you look really closely, you can start to see, it sort of defines the plane of the water, right? If you wanted to say, where is the surface of the water and sort of trace it, it's much better in real life. Obviously, on a screen, it's a little bit hard to see. But that then defines really the form of the piece. Very similar to the way the motive in the Debussy piece will define kind of where we are and or be changed or be developed by the surrounding texture. The last thing I want to say about this painting, and then I'll go on to play, is there's a very definite three-part texture that tends to happen. In this, obviously, there's the plane of the water, right, where the water lilies are, and we can determine that plane by the shape of the water lilies. Like here, they're flat, but over there, they're at an angle. Then there's whatever is underneath the water, right? Seaweed, this and that, and whatever it is that's reflecting from above. And so all of these things come, and they all exist, to define the plane. And for me, what's I think amazing, I'm not a painter, I can't even begin to imagine how to accomplish this. But what I think is an amazing feat is that he's created these three levels. The level of the plane of the water, which sort of goes out into the distance, what's underneath and what's on top, but it's all created on a flat canvas. Right? To me, it's amazing. It's like magic. I don't know how it could be done. But what does that have to do with Debussy? Well, the same three-part texture or whatever, the changing texture from how we will see the little melody that I mentioned, how we will see it being changed and supported, that all changes on a single plane as well. But for us, it's time. It's the timeline as it goes forward. And on the painting, it's the vertical canvas, I would say. Also a very interesting connection. So I'd like to play it now and have this in mind. This is the Reflections on the Water by Debussy from 1905. concept or idea of Debussy's that I'd like to talk about is the idea of kind of creating chords. In other words, we talked about using functional chords in a non-functional way. In other words, taking chords that sort of kind of exist already and using them but in an unusual or a different way. Debussy also sometimes just creates chords, okay? And by adding notes and so on. And that would not be so unusual in earlier time. You know, composers would add notes that would make things more dissonant, but the purpose was really to enhance this idea of directionality. In other words, to enhance the function of the chord. But Debussy just adds notes because he likes them. I have the exact feeling of if he was painting at the keyboard. I'll just show an example. This is going to be from, well, this is actually, this is from Ondine, a prelude, which I'm going to play in a short while. But there's a spot where there's an arpeggio like this. This is what it actually sounds like. That's what the actual sound is. So for me, it's very iridescent, very kind of alive sound, right? It's almost like sparkling or shimmering or something like that. Let's imagine we're painting it and making it from scratch. What if I started with just it's basically a B-flat arpeggio. So what if I started with this? Well, it sounds nice, right? It's beautiful, B-flat. It's a great piano, it's in tune. What else would you want? It sounds great. But it's a little bit straightforward. I mean, it's a little bit monochromatic, let's say, one color. So what if he says, here's Debussy, I'm going to add a little bit of this color. So we'll put the A flat in. It's a little bit more color, like there's a little touch in there. Still, it's still not iridescent enough. It's still not radiant enough. What if he says, okay, I'm going to add a C. Now it's starting to get some shimmering effect or whatever. Still not good enough. Say, okay, I'm going to add a G. It's almost like, you know, he's got a palette, right? And he's saying, oh, I'm going to add a little orange, or I'm going to add a little red or something. So, now it's getting it. But still, well, we know what the final result is, but still, as it's not quite there. It still doesn't have that like touch of sparkle or radiance. So he adds these little tiny touches of probably some completely unrelated color, because the notes that he adds are completely unrelated to the harmony. And the notes he adds, right? And now it shimmers and now it sparkles. So I think it's extremely interesting. Another idea of harmony being used in a non-traditional way is the idea of bitonality. Bitonality means two keys at the same time. So what am I talking about? If I play a song, fine, that sounds nice. If I accompany it, sounds great. I played it in C major. What if I played it in C sharp major? Sounds fine. Well, what if I took the melody in one key and I played the accompaniment in a different key? That's bitonality. In other words, two keys simultaneously. Let's see what it sounds like. So does it sound, I mean, can we still recognize it? Did you still know what's Of course. But it's a way of creating a really amazingly, sort of alive kind of sound combination. So that's bitonality. It appears the next piece that I would like to play is called Feu d'artifice, which is fireworks. It's one of Debussy's preludes. It's from 1913, is when it was written. And it's very interesting. The preludes all have titles. Sometimes they're descriptions of places or of people and so on. But he usually puts the title at the end of the piece, which at first seems, well, he's just being quirky or something like that. I don't think so. I think it really is pointing to that idea of the post-impressionist and the symbolist sort of expression of the important thing is the effect that the music has on you, it's not a description of it. So I think that applies beautifully to fireworks. There's going to be stuff in this that sounds like he's trying to describe fireworks. There's going to be crashes and bangs and all kinds of things. But it's not meant to be a description. In other words, he's not pretending that the way that sounds actually looks like a firework explosion, but he's trying to say that our reaction to those sounds is much like the reaction would be to these fireworks. And that particular reaction is very personal, and it tells us a lot about ourselves and about all kinds of things. But anyway, I think that's the case. So in this piece, Fireworks, there is a place where he uses bitonality. At the very end, after a great big crash, you won't miss it, even if you're sleeping, I guarantee it will wake you up. There'll be a big crash, and then you'll hear a little bit of the French national anthem, just a little fragment, in the key of C major. But at the same time, the accompaniment is in D flat major. So that's kind of what I did with Twinkle Twinkle, right? And the effect is, I think it's kind of stunning. It's like after the big exposition or the big explosions and stuff are finished, then off far in the distance, while the smoke is clearing, you hear this little touch of maybe some country band playing the national anthem and so on. So it creates this real sense. You probably experienced it. I mean, everyone's been to fireworks, right? And when it's all done, right, then there's that last final big, like, what, kabang, and then the smoke's going away, and everyone has this kind of feeling of I don't know what, there's almost this suspension and so on. So I think that's what he's creating. The other thing that's interesting in Feu d'Artifice is the idea of glissando. The piano glissando just means you play a scale, but you don't play each note individually, you just kind of go, you know, like a blues pianist would go at the end and slide across the keys. So you could do that on the white keys, or you could do it on the black keys, right? But this is the first piece, or as far as I know, it's the only piece where he does both at the same time. So at the end, you'll hear both a glissando for both white and black keys at the same time. As I've said many times, it makes an enormous racket. It is really fun to play, and I'm sure you will not miss it. So this is Feu d'Artifice by Debussy. I'm not putting up a fireworks picture because everybody knows. The reason I have this painting up, the La Grenouille, I'm probably saying it not quite right, but it's a Monet painting, and the thing that I think is astounding about it, and I love so much, is the water, which looks like it's shimmering, right? I mean, this is terrible, it's just a projection, but in real life, if you see the real one, I mean, it just looks like, almost looks like metallic, almost like aluminum or something, doesn't it? It's so shiny. But when you go close, when you go really close, which you can't do here, but when you go right up to the painting and look, which I did, and then of course it's at the Met in New York, and you know the security guards start. You can't go too close. But anyway, if you go close up, you see that the composition of the water is really just white and black and gray. They're very kind of matte, normal oil colors, or they're not shiny. It's not like some kind of shiny paint or something like that. But the combination of those colors and their close position like that, and the way he's created, of course, which seems haphazard and random, but I know in Monet's case it's absolutely not. It's extremely detailed and very precise and very careful, but it gives this image of shimmering. And the reason I'm bringing it up, I want to make the parallel to this. Remember the idea of bitonality? Remember Twinkle Twinkle with in two different keys at the same time. So in the next piece that I'd like to play, which is Ondine, it's another prelude from 1913, pardon me. There's a lot of things to say about this, but one is at the very end, it's kind of one of my favorite moments really in Debussy. There's some arpeggios, and the arpeggio is created, I'll play it first, and then it has very much of a shimmering effect, I would say. It reminds me so much of the water in this painting. It's kind of shimmering. And so we know that Monet created that shimmering simply by putting very contrasting and different things next to each other. And maybe it's an optical illusion, I don't know, but that's what creates the shimmer. Debussy does it with bitonality. In other words, he takes two very normal chords, takes a D major chord, it can't be any more normal than that, and he takes an F sharp major chord, can't be any more normal than that, but if you put them together, it starts vibrating and shimmering and so on. So that's what happens at the end. I'm going to explain in a minute why I believe it's happening. But after several times of this arpeggio kind of floating around and creating this kind of shimmering effect, he simply removes one of the chords. In other words, he takes out the F sharp chord and he leaves the D major chord, so then it becomes perfectly smooth and perfectly clear. So now, in order to see why that's significant, the idea of Ondine, the prelude, it's based on a sort of a mythological character, Ondine, who's kind of a water sprite or nymph or fairy or whatever you want to think of. There's a lot of different versions of it. There's the French Ondine, there's Lorelei in German, and there's the sirens from Greek mythology and so on. And basically, for one reason or other, this is a supernatural being, woman, female, who lives in the water and is calling out to sailors or whatever. The actual story of Ondine it's a little gruesome, so I'm just going to do a G-rated version. And the idea is, there's a young man walking along the water, and he hears something. He doesn't know what it is. Right? He hears like some rustling or whatever. Anyway, it turns out to be this Ondine who is kind of calling him and doing beautiful exotic dances and wonderful things, calling him to join her. And if he does, then he forgets his home, and that's kind of the end of it. So in this Ondine, you'll hear three different kinds of music. One is sort of water, like arpeggios and things like I just played. Another thing you'll hear is dancing, music that's dancing. And I have to put a little sideline here. Everybody knows or should remember, from class or whatever, that Debussy was very much interested in something called the gamelan, which is a Eastern percussion ensemble. It has all kinds of little cymbals and bells and so on. It's a very, very interesting sound. So I think we're hearing some of that in this. There'll be a place where we hear. computer symbols or something. Right? You can almost imagine it. So there's the water music, there's this dancing, kind of very exotic and alluring dancing, and then there's the voice of the ondine, which almost always, but not always, almost always happens as a single voice. Calling, telling him to come in, and so on. So when the ondine happens, when you hear that ondine voice, it's always the same. It's never developed, it never changes. Remember, reflections, the melodic fragment never changes. But in the middle of the piece, we'll hear that ondine melody over and over again, 3 times really, and each time the texture around it is different, so that it completely changes the meaning and the feeling and the character and everything. It's another example of this idea of development by texture rather than actually manipulating the notes and so on. I think I have, let me pass over that for now. So this is a case of a composition that is actually inspired by real artwork. So this is an illustration from a book by Radosavljevic. He actually illustrated lots of children's books, and I think he did the whole Ring, or at least some Wagner operas with all these illustrations. Kind of amazing stuff. But there you can see the ondine, and you can see the water, and so on. This is an actual connection of the painting to the music. You might say, well, no, that's not particularly impressionist looking. And I think the idea is, this goes back to Debussy's real sort of underlying drive or motivation. It's not this idea of fluffy impressionism or whatever, but it's the idea of finding truths and finding things in our reaction to the artwork and to the reaction to the music and so on. So anyway, this is Ondine from Radosavljevic. little bit. The young man was walking by the river. The Ondine calls him. There's kind of a struggle. You know, there's big kind of noisy stuff. Some kind of struggle. Maybe it's physical. Maybe it's emotional. I don't know. But there's some kind of struggle. Then when it's over, those arpeggios. Remember the thing about the bitonal D major against F sharp major. For me, those are the rippling water. Remember, like the Monet. And as each arpeggio goes, it gets less and less and quiet. And then finally, when the F sharp is removed and we only have D major, then it's as if the water. Imagine that you see a pond or a pool of water or something, or a small lake, and you've thrown a rock in there, right? And there are little ripples, and the ripples are sort of dissipating slowly. And then finally, at some point, the water goes back to being glass smooth again. So that's what happens in my version. That's what happens when we get to that pure D major again. The water goes back to being perfectly smooth, the reflection of the clouds, just like in the water lilies. And it's as if nothing had ever happened. So I think that's the idea of that bitonality. This was a part of Ondine that we just played. And it's just a little bit interesting. We talked about the three-part texture, like in the water lilies, and three-part texture occurs a lot in Debussy. But in this case, there is a three-part texture, and you can actually see it. On the top line, that's the Ondine melody up near the end there. In the middle there is, I don't know, kind of like strings or water being played. And then you can see the left hand has this very ominous bass thing. So it's actually a three-part texture physically. And he writes it on 3 staffs, which is a little unusual, right? Normally piano music would be on 2. But he actually uses 3. Maybe partly to show that, maybe partly easier to read. I don't know. But it does connect very nicely. This was the D major against F sharp arpeggios, and at the end, the very bottom there, that's where it's D major only, and that's what gives it that impression. This was the Ondine again. Now I want to go to my last piece, which is L'Île Joyeuse, which is the Isle of Joy, or the Joyful Island, and so on. And this is another piece that's actually related to a specific painting. And this is the painting. It's by Watteau, A Pilgrimage to the Isle of Cythera, or Kitara, I think in Greek. Anyway, it's a mythological, it's an actual island in the Mediterranean, but in mythology, it was the home of the goddess Venus, which is goddess of love and of beauty and so on. And you can see in the painting up at the far right, there's actually her statue there. And then on the far left, there's the boat that people have arrived. The idea being that some, maybe Parisians or whatever society, have decided they're going to hop in a boat and cross the Mediterranean and find this island of Cythera, where the goddess of Venus, her home was in mythology and so on. And so this is kind of a depiction of that. There's the picture of the goddess, and there's all the happy, people. There's the ship, and there's all these cherubs floating around, which is kind of nice. But anyway, this is not, again, it's not Impressionist art, really. It's 200 years earlier. 1717 it was written, it's 200 years earlier. But it still ties into that symbolist, post-impressionist idea of the sort of the justification or the modifying factors in Debussy's music. There's one other, I'll go on to the next. There's 2 versions of this painting, actually. It's kind of interesting. That one is in the Charlottenburg in Berlin. This is another version. This is in the Louvre. It's still kind of the same, but it's maybe a little more subtle. You can't really see the ship, so that's why I like the other one better. Okay, this is some of the music from it. And I want to throw in one more compositional device that Debussy likes, which ties in also very much with painting. And this is the idea of, some people would call it parallelism, some call it planing. And it's the idea of taking a melodic line and really just expanding it so that it becomes thicker and more resonant and so on, which really would be the parallel of Cézanne or someone taking a bigger brush and making a thicker line, and then all of the textures and all of the things that happen within that become part of the expression and so on. So the way it works is that if you took like a melody, let's take my old, it's just a simple melody. If I play it in one note, okay, I could expand it and play it in doubles. I could play it in lots more. What if I decided to make it into chords? As they would in a normal scale or in a normal key. But what they do is they make that simple melody thicker and bigger and more sort of colorful and so on. So that's the idea of planning. That's going to happen in Les Joyeuses. He makes it even more, a little bit more interesting, a little more shimmering by manipulating it rhythmically. There's a part where there's a melody. So the melody is really just a simple melody, and he decides to expand it into chords, just like I did with Twinkle. But it's not quite shimmery enough for him, I think, and so he kind of combines two different rhythms. To me, that again, it sounds very much, or it brings up very much this idea of the Monet, where he combines the different colors of paint and he gets a shimmering effect. Debussy combines different rhythms, the double rhythm and the triple rhythm. The right hand has, it's in threes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then the other hand, it's just twos. So the twos against the threes kind of create almost this interference pattern and so on. Anyway, that's something that happens. The idea of Les Joyeuses, the painting, I mean the music, is that it's really kind of, if we take this painting as being the Parisians have arrived and they're there or whatever, the music is actually the backstory. In other words, this is how they got there. It starts with kind of a mysterious kind of trill, like, you know, maybe it's the idea in someone's mind that, oh yeah, we should get on the ship and go out in the Mediterranean. Then there's some very dancing, frolicking kind of music, right? You can imagine, maybe they've had a glass of wine, I don't know, but, and they're happily, you know, making their way down to the boat and leaving the harbor and going out into the sea. There's a middle section of the piece, which for me is they're out on the ocean. You'll notice that the left hand has these slow arpeggios that go up and go down, obviously waves, right, sort of giving the sense. He's not trying to describe the waves, remember. He's trying to evoke our impression or invoke the effect that the waves have on us, sort of psychologically or emotionally. Anyway, there's this, they're out on the ocean, they're out on the Mediterranean, it's kind of beautiful green, blue color and so on. Then he gets more excited again. Someone must have said, there's land, there's the island. Everything gets very active again, and there's some music that sounds like drums. Again, not necessarily meant to imitate drums, but to create in us the effect that drums would create, which they do, right? If you're watching a parade and you hear boom, boom, it creates this reaction, it creates this impression. And trumpets and so on, and it's kind of like their triumphant, joyful arrival at the island. So all the music is really related to the painting in the sense that this is how they got to where they are now. This is Les Joyeuses by Debussy from 1912. If anyone has any thoughts or comments or questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Otherwise, have a great evening.